Hello, everyone, and welcome to Slash Film Daily for Friday, September 27th, 2019. On today's episode, we're going to talk about the latest film and TV news. This is Slash Film Editor-in-Chief Peter Sciretta, and joining me on today's podcast is Slash Film Weekend Editor Brad Oman.
Hey, that's me.
We got the whole podcast to ourselves because we are short-staffed today. But we got a lot of interesting and exciting news to talk about. Let's start with probably the most exciting news bit of today's podcast, and that is that it was revealed this morning that Spider-Man will stay in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. What do we know, Brad?
That's right. Spider-Man is back in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, at least for the foreseeable future. In a surprise announcement today from both Sony Pictures and Walt Disney Studios, the two announced that they have struck a new deal for Kevin Feige to produce a third film in the Spider-Man franchise that will be released on July 16th, 2021, with Tom Holland back as Spider-Man. And on top of that, the deal also includes an appearance by Spider-Man in a future Marvel Studios film, though it has not been named specifically which movie that might be. In the press release, Kevin Feige said, quote, "I'm thrilled that Spidey's journey in the MCU will continue, and I and all of us at Marvel Studios are very excited that we get to keep working on it. Spider-Man is a powerful icon and hero whose story crosses all ages and audiences around the globe. He also happens to be the only hero with a superpower to cross cinematic universes, so as Sony continues to develop their own Spideyverse, you never know what surprises the future might hold." So that sounds like an interesting hint as to what the future might hold for Spider-Man, perhaps existing both in the Marvel Cinematic Universe and maybe a separate Spider-Man universe that Sony Pictures controls. And that makes sense considering Kevin Feige previously hinted that it was likely a crossover with Tom Holland's Spider-Man and Tom Hardy's Venom would eventually happen.
What do we think of that, though? Because I feel like Kevin Feige's not going to have control over those crossovers, right? Like, he's only going to be in control of the Marvel Cinematic Universe side of things. So, like, you have two companies controlling this one popular franchise character, and I feel like, they could make a Venom versus Spider-Man movie, and if they do it badly, it could taint, Tom Holland's version of Peter Parker.
I mean, if they figure out a way to make a clear definition between the two, I think that people would understand exactly, the difference, and maybe would be able to understand, okay, so this Spider-Man is the good one, but the one that's in this one, it's not that great anymore. But I mean, personally, I think the best part of this is that at the very least, they can maybe finish what they intended to do with Spider-Man's arc by doing a third movie. And I wouldn't be surprised if whatever that other Marvel movie is that they mention is the one that maybe explains how he leaves the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Perhaps there's some kind of way for him to do it through Doctor Strange or something like that, and maybe he has to leave to go to a parallel universe or alternate timeline to stay safe from something that's happening in his universe. There's a lot of possibilities here.
Oh, wait. So you're suggesting that, he'll do this film and the other film, and then he will be gone from the Marvel Cinematic Universe and only in the Sony universe at that point?
Yeah, maybe. That's a possibility.
Or, I was reading the quote as he was going to exist in both universes at the same time, and that would be super confusing.
Yeah, I mean, I think either is possible, but the second one, I'm hypothesizing as a possible explanation as to how that could work, if that's not the case.
I mean, I would like that more, but that would still mean the Spider-Man leaves the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I mean, I guess he would at least be able to end his arc, like you said.
Yeah, exactly. And then maybe, at some point, if, Sony ends up not being able to do anything good with that Spider-Man, then they can bring him back into the MCU with a new deal, sometime down the road.
Yeah. Speaking of new deals, I've been reading Bob Iger's new book. It's called The Ride of a Lifetime, Lessons Learned from 15 Years as CEO of Walt Disney Company. I've been listening to it on Audible. I'll probably talk about this on the water cooler next week. But first of all, the first chapter is read by Bob Iger, and I was like super excited because I was like, oh, Bob Iger's going to read this whole book to me. But no, it's only the first chapter. Then it's like one of those normal, audiobook narrators. But it is a fascinating book, giving a lot of inside behind the scenes gossip There's three different, like, there's a chapter on the Pixar acquisition, there's a chapter on Marvel, there's a chapter on Star Wars. I think for those three chapters alone, it's worth picking up this book and reading it. But as I was reading this book yesterday, and there's tons of stuff that hasn't been picked up online, that is just like literally like a sentence that's just dropped in the middle of a paragraph that's like, oh my God, that would have changed the face of everything. So one of those things yesterday I was reading, and in the middle of him talking about how he negotiated with Steve Jobs to acquire Pixar Animation Studios, he mentions in a just like a, I don't know, just offhanded way, he says, a few years later, Steve would propose shutting down Disney Animation completely and just making animated films of Pixar. Even John Lasseter and Ed Catmull hated this idea, and I rejected it. So that's crazy that was, I mean, I guess that like at that time, let's rewind, because we're now in the world of Frozen and Moana and Wreck-It Ralph and these big Walt Disney Animation hits. But back when the Pixar deal was made, Walt Disney Animation Studios was not in a good place. I think even Iger said that, like, he was in the Disney parks and he watched a parade and all the characters were all Pixar characters, and nobody had an affinity for, the Walt Disney Animation characters coming out of those movies. So, right now it's like, oh, Steve Jobs was dumb. But at that point, it was a much different landscape. And what Jobs was proposing was that they, had Pixar Animation Studios in Emeryville create the future of Disney animation and actually shut down Walt Disney Animation Studios. And Brett, that would have changed everything. Like, literally, like, I can't even imagine what this world would be without, Let It Go and all the stuff that has come from Walt Disney Animation Studios since. Thankfully, John Lasseter, and Ed Catmull both had a love for that studio. I mean, that studio's where that got them into animation, and Bob Iger rejected it. But, like, what do you think? Like, was this a ridiculous idea?
I mean, at the time, it wasn't so ridiculous just because Disney was not doing very well. We're talking about late 90s, early 2000s Disney, where they weren't really putting out that great of stuff. Their best movies were Mulan and Lilo and Stitch. And by Disney Renaissance standards, they were fine, but they weren't anywhere near on the level of the critical acclaim and box office draw that movies like Aladdin and The Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast and The Lion King were. So Disney Animation was just really struggling at the time. And so when you see Pixar doing so well and they just spent all this money to buy the animation studio, why wouldn't you think, okay, well, this is our future of animation now and we'll stick with this. But from a creative level, that would have been really depressing because, not only is Disney this, has always been this powerhouse of animation, but not all animated movies need to be Pixar movies. I love Pixar to death. There are only a couple of Pixar movies that I'm only meh on, and I usually love the rest of them. But it's nice to have a change of pace. You don't want every movie trying to emulate Pixar. You want some variance because animation is a medium and not a genre.
Yeah.
And
but maybe at that point, maybe Pixar would have done like musicals and done some of the stuff that Walt Disney Animation Studio. Like maybe it would have diversified Pixar more.
I don't know. I don't think so. Just because I don't think that Pixar wanted to try to be Disney. Yeah. They wanted to be Pixar, and so I think it's good that Lasseter and Ed Catmull, saw that they needed to preserve Walt Disney Animation Studios and keep that alive, with Disney's style.
Yeah. I was going to bring this up in the water cooler, but there's another story in here that I don't think we've reported on, but it's been on a couple of the business sites. But it was talking about the process of acquiring Pixar, and the day that they were going to announce this, like they were going to announce it at Apple Campus, and it was a half an hour before the signing and announcement. Steve Jobs told Bob Iger, he was like, can we go for a walk? And Iger went with him, and Steve Jobs loved walks, and he told him on this walk that he was like, confidentially, you can't repeat this because the only person that knows this is my wife at this point. He's like, the cancer has come back. I'm going to die. I'm about to become the biggest shareholder in the company. I'm about to become a board member. I'm telling you this because this is your last chance. You can pull out of the deal. Which is, like, insane. At that point, if Iger had pulled out of the deal, it's not even like he could go back to the board and be like, we're pulling out of the deal because Steve Jobs is going to die. You know, like, all the stuff. He can't tell anybody. So in that, like, moment, in that, like, half an hour bit of time, he had to, like, by himself make that decision, which is pretty crazy.
Yeah, actually, if even if you don't have the book, Vanity Fair published a piece that's basically an abridged version of different sections from Bob Iger's book, and part of it includes that story that you just told. So we should put that link in the story in the show notes. Yeah,
we'll put that in the other articles mentioned section. But I'll talk about this more on the water cooler next week. Let's move on from Steve Jobs to Apple TV and what Apple is currently doing. We know that they are doing their streaming service. They're making TV shows. They're making movies. And we haven't been clear on what's going to happen. Like, are these movies going to go straight to the service, or are they going to hit theaters? And now we have a little bit more of an indication of what Apple plans. Brad, what do we know?
Apple TV is looking to follow in the footsteps of Amazon by playing nice with movie theaters. Netflix, in the past few years, has become very aggressive with trying to push movie theaters away from the traditional 3-month theatrical window that most movies get when they go into theaters, simply because they want to put a movie in theaters for a little bit and then have it go right into the Netflix library. And movie theaters aren't cool with that, because the longer a movie stays in theaters, the more money they get from the ticket sales. But Apple doesn't want to shake things up. They just want to be able to release their movies in theaters and then send them to their streaming service sometime down the road. And they're hoping to follow Amazon's footsteps by doing what they do with their movies, which is they give it a full theatrical release for a few months, and then a little bit later, after it comes out on home video, they put it in their streaming library. So Apple TV has already been talking with a lot of theater chains about doing this, but this isn't something that they're going to be doing with all of their movies. One of the ones that's mentioned that will probably be their first major theatrical release will be On the Rocks, which is the next movie from Sofia Coppola that follows Rashida Jones as a woman looking to reconnect with her eccentric father, who's played by Bill Murray. And that's the first movie that is part of their partnership with A24. And they're hoping that they can release it in the summer of 2020, possibly right after us, or at least shortly after it premieres at Cannes Film Festival, if they they manage to strike a deal to have the film play there. But there will be smaller movies too. There's this article from the Wall Street Journal with this information mentions that they already have a documentary called The Elephant Queen, which follows an elephant leading her herd across Africa, that will be available on Apple TV Plus when the service launches on November 1st. And they've already been talking about giving it a smaller theatrical release rather than a full 3-month window in order to have it qualify for awards before it goes on to be on their streaming service.
Yeah, I mean, this makes sense. Like, they were courting J.J. Abrams, and I don't think they had a chance of getting him not that they got him, they didn't, but I don't think they would have even been in the ballpark if they weren't going to show things on the big screen, because I feel like that's something that would have been appealing to, like, someone like Abrams, and it's definitely going to be appealing to other filmmakers that are making films for Apple. I'm just, like, wondering, like, Apple, you know, for years and years were known as innovators, and now, like, it seems like very much what the direction of this company is the status quo. And it doesn't seem like they're doing anything different than the other guys are doing, especially with the streaming service, which, Brad, like, is there going to be anything different? Like, or is this going to, like, are they just taking the lead of everybody else?
Yeah, I mean, in this case, it seems like they are taking the lead of everything else, because, I mean, Apple is first and foremost, you know, a tech company. And so I feel like that they'll always maybe have more innovation there than they do anywhere else, even though they've also gotten criticism for lacking in that in recent years, especially since, you know, Steve Jobs passed away. But, you know, I think the biggest problem is that the streaming wars are just so crowded at this point that it's hard to do anything that's new, you know? I mean, the only thing that is innovative right now about the world of streaming is something like what Quibi is doing. You know, and we're kind of laughing, you know, at what they're doing, because everything they're doing just sounds so off the wall and kind of odd. So at this point, I just think we've reached a time in this, you know, battle for streaming supremacy where there's not a lot of new things that can be done. So Apple is just kind of like, all right, well, we'll see what we can do.
Yeah. I'd like to see some more innovation. Not that I don't want to see movies in theaters. I do. But I want to see them change things up a bit and try something different. But let's talk about streaming. Let's talk about Netflix and Martin Scorsese. They are doing The Irishman. The movie has made its premiere today in New York City, and our own Chris Evangelista and Hoai Tran Bui were both in attendance. We wrote up a early buzz article. Chris is going to be doing a full review, but I'll read to you a couple of the reactions, which I am kind of surprised because judging by the trailers for this film, I was kind of like a little underwhelmed by the trailers. But the reactions here are are a lot more hopeful. So anyways, Chris says The Irishman is a masterwork. Funny, epic, and most of all, melancholy. It's Scorsese's confronting aging, legacies, and mortality. I may or may not have teared up at the end. And HT is a little bit, she's still hyperbolic, but a little bit more critical. She says, The Irishman made me hungry. Martin Scorsese's bid to make his Citizen Kane is pretty close to a masterpiece. De Niro, Pacino, Pesci are all firing on all cylinders, and the 3+ runtime rarely drags. The de-aging effects are rough, but I couldn't imagine the sprawling saga without De Niro in the entire time. And we have a roundup of everybody that has tweeted out from that screening, but the word masterpiece, masterwork, comparisons to Scorsese's earlier films, it seems like very high praise. So yeah, that's something we can look forward to. The Irishman, that's going to be hit theaters before it's going to be on Netflix. But by the time you hear this, I'm sure Chris's review might even be on the site, so you might want to check that out as well. But let's hit our last story, which we talked earlier about Spider-Man reuniting in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Tom Holland is the star of that series, and he's also going to be the star of Uncharted, a movie that lost its director Dan Trachtenberg around the same time that Spider-Man lost the MCU. But it seems like Sony has found a new director to be their puppet. To be their director. Brad, what do we know?
Oh, that's sad. Yeah, it looks like Sony is just fixing all their problems today. They have Bumblebee director Travis Knight taking over after Dan Trachtenberg recently left. We never really found out why he left the film, so it's unclear exactly what happened, whether it was scheduling or creative issues. But Travis Knight is coming in to keep the movie on track. It sounds like they're still hoping to hit that December 2020 release date that was previously set. They're going to have to move pretty fast if they want to do that, though. So we'll see if they can make it happen. As much as I would have loved Dan Trachtenberg to direct this movie, Travis Knight's a pretty solid replacement. I was a big fan of Bumblebee, and I think that he did a good job of bringing the Transformers franchise back to a good space. He added some real heart, and he gave the franchise focus instead of having it be this big mash of tons of metal characters and an ensemble cast that you don't care about and everything. And he gave us, kind of a magical sci-fi adventure that felt like it came straight out of the 1980s. So I'm hoping that maybe he's got enough, in him that he can maybe turn this into an action adventure throwback, from the same decade, maybe even something from the 90s, and can make this work. But at this point, it's been so long that Uncharted has been in development that I'm not even going to believe this movie is actually happening until I'm sitting in the theater watching it.
Yeah. I am a fan of Travis Knight. I like what he's done at the stop motion animated company that he runs. And I loved Bumblebee. Bumblebee was a good movie. And I know that was another similar situation where the studio had a release date, they had a script, and they had a ticking clock, and they hired him, and he came in and made the best out of a bad situation, and the movie ended up being good. So there's that, but it seems like he is what
the downside here is that the script comes from Art Markham and Matt Holloway, who are the writers behind Men in Black International and Transformers: The Last Knight, both movies that are extremely disappointing for a number of reasons.
That's not good. And but maybe Travis Knight can make something of it. But Travis Knight aside, even when Dan Trachtenberg was involved in this movie franchise, I was skeptical that a Uncharted movie. I don't play many video games, but I played a little bit of Uncharted 2 and I think the first one. And those movies are just so cinematic. They're such a emulation of Indiana Jones and, maybe John McClane from Die Hard. It's like a mashup of different things. And I feel like if you do it right, it's just going to seem like a copy of a copy of a copy. Like, I don't know if there's not a way to top the cutscenes in the video game. And when you're playing the video game and even when you're like doing those quick time events where like it seems like you're in danger, but you're not, you're so invested in those moments of hanging off something that you can't feel that investment watching someone not connected on the big screen. And I'm not sure there's a way to do an Uncharted movie where it will be better or as good as the video game. Do you have any connection to the video game, Brad?
No, I've actually not played Uncharted at all. The closest I've come is just seeing trailers for the game whenever a new iteration comes out, and it looks like a very fun game. I just haven't taken the time to play it.
Yeah, well, we'll see how this turns out. But it looks like Tom Holland is back in the game, and Sony is making good because it seems like if I was Tom Holland, I wouldn't have been happy a few weeks back when all that stuff was announced. But okay, that brings us to the end of today's Slash Film Daily. Brad, where can people find more of your work online?
Always on slashfilm.com, also on Twitter at Ethan_Anderson, and you can also find my own podcast, Go Flix Yourself, available on iTunes and other podcasting platforms.
You can find me at slashfilm.com. You can find all the stories we mentioned on today's podcast in the show notes. This podcast, Slash Film Daily, is published every weekday on iTunes, Google, Overcast, Spotify, all the popular podcast apps. Please feel free to send your feedback, questions, comments, concerns to us at peter@slashfilm.com. And please rate and read this podcast on iTunes. Tell your friends. Spread the word. We'll see you on Monday.